If you were a VIP in the West in the 1830s and 1840s, Bent's Fort was a magnet that would attract you sooner or later.
It's a 50-day trip to the nearest town. A lot of hazard conditions on the trail to deal with.
Now you get below the surface, there's all sorts of relationships, events and so forth that might not look like they're related, but they are.
This was a Hispanic village operated by American entrepreneurs trading with American Indian customers. Although it was in what most Americans considered the wilderness, it had a very cosmopolitan feeling of trade and politics and society.
Colorado Experience is a co-production of Rocky Mountain PBS and History Colorado.
History Colorado brings history to life for audiences of all ages. Through exhibits, collections, and historic preservation programs throughout the state, History Colorado connects people to the stories, places, and heritage of Colorado's past that provide perspectives on today and inspire our choices for tomorrow. Find out more at www.historycolorado.org. Additional funding provided by El Pomar Foundation and the Betcher Foundation, celebrating 75 years of philanthropy in Colorado.
With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And from viewers like you, thank you.
The fur trade era of the 1820s and 30s and 40s was a very brief period in American history, but it's an extremely romantic period as well. It seemed like these mountain men represented a new kind of freedom and a new kind of enterprise and energy and spirit in American life. And they became romanticized as archetypes of what Americans really could be. Of course, the reality was that most of them were company employees. They were working for wages. Their lives were very difficult. Living out in the mountains in the wintertime was a brutal and sometimes short endeavor.
William Bent was the son of Silas Bent. Silas was from St. Louis, and William grew up in St. Charles, Missouri, and he heard about the fur trading on the Missouri River. And his earlier young years, he was working with the trading companies on the Missouri River. Ended up hearing about the fur trapping in the mountains, and he and his brother Charles decided to trap their hair rodents in the mountains.
The lure of the West got them both, and Charles first came out as a trapper, and then William followed, and they trapped the mountains, the Rockies, for several years.
Those old mountaineers, they had to be tough old birds. Most of them had rheumatism. Again, you're trapping when it's cold. And there's always dangers. Independent, self-sufficient. You can't depend on somebody coming in and saving you. But on the other hand, you've got to be able to be willing to help other people out. Because chances are somewhere down the road, that's going to come back to you. Now, you're going to be in a similar situation. That's going to make a huge difference as far as how we view each other, how we treat each other, how we help each other out.
William had an encounter with a couple Cheyenne at a stockade that he had built in the vicinity of where Pueblo, Colorado is today. And while those Cheyenne were there talking to him, some Comanches came up to the stockade, and the Cheyenne and Comanches were not friends. So William actually hid the Cheyenne, and the Cheyenne were always very grateful to William for that. And that kind of started the relationship that William had with the Cheyenne people and the Cheyenne tribe. A lot of the the streams in the central Rockies were getting trapped out, so it was getting harder and harder to find beaver. You're having to go further and further afield. So a lot of these trappers started to look for other ways to make money.
In 1821, Mexico won its independence from the Spanish Empire and immediately opened up trade with the United States down a road that became known as the Santa Fe Trail, a 900-mile route that connected St. Louis, Missouri with Santa Fe, New Mexico, and ultimately stretched all the way down into Chihuahua and Sonora as well. That was a trade route that allowed American traders to travel into Mexican territories and trade for silver and gold and mules and introduce manufactured goods from America and Europe and Asia, and really a global trade.
When William and Charles decided to look for something else to do besides trapping, they thought of the fur trade still, but the buffalo hide trade this time, and with the Plains tribes. And with William already establishing that relationship with the Cheyenne, they built their post out here.
This area is prevalent for the Plains buffalo herds, and they travel up and migrate up and down the Front Range by the millions. And the Arapahoe, Cheyenne, Kiowa, Comanches were of this area, and they used the Plains buffalo for all their needs. And William Bent, along with his brother Charles and a third partner, Sir Anne St. Vrain, recognized the opportunity here to build a mud castle here in 1833 as a way to trade with the Indians and the mountain men from the mountains. To build with logs would have been impossible because there's not any timber growing here to speak of. So the next best thing to build with is adobe. And people from Taos and Santa Fe have been building their houses out of mud for centuries, and so this is nothing new for them. The good thing about it is it's cheap to build this way. It's impervious to cannonballs and bullets. It's hard to burn it down. It's easy to defend that way. So it's like a mud ship on the ocean. However, it was far away from the nearest port of call, Independence, Missouri. It's 50 days away. And like on any ship on the ocean, you have to have a way to protect yourselves because you never know who may show up. And hacienda styles like this is perfect for that reason. But it washes off all the time, and so they constantly would have to rebuild the fort.
It was the largest, it was the most important, and certainly the most celebrated settlement in what became Colorado in the 1830s and 1840s. In order to organize their trading operations, Charles Bent, William Bent, and Sir Anne St. Vrain split up their trading empire. Charles Bent was headquartered in St. Louis, and he made the connections between European manufacturers and American manufacturers who were supplying things like iron barrel hoops and knives and tomahawks and guns and gunpowder that he would then send down the Santa Fe Trail to Bent's Fort and to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Sir Anne St. Vrain operated the stores in Taos and Santa Fe. He was the distributor who received those goods and exchanged them for silver and gold and horses and mules and other goods coming up from Mexico. But in the middle of the trade route sat William Bent at Bent's Fort. It initially served trappers who were bringing beaver furs out of the Rocky Mountains, but in time in the 1830s and 1840s, as the beaver trade declined, it was replaced by a trade for buffalo robes and hides, which were collected by American Indians. Cheyenne and Arapahoe hunters would kill bison, their wives would process the hides, and then they would trade the buffalo robes at Bent's Old Fort for manufactured goods.
William Bent, from the time of his encounter with the Cheyenne at the stockade near Pueblo, always had a close relationship with the Cheyenne.
William was a very strong individual. He was very influential. He was very open-minded with the Native Americans, and he was very good with languages. He was able to speak many languages fluently. He respected the Indian traditions.
William Bent dressed in buckskins, he lived in teepees. He very much became a part of his customers' culture in order to better understand them, but also in order to tie those commercial relationships tightly. In fact, he married a Cheyenne woman named Owl Woman, who was the daughter of one of the Cheyenne's prominent holy men, a man named Gray Thunder. In doing that, he basically solidified the trade relationships between the Cheyennes and also the Arapahoes and his company, essentially making his customers into kin and building up a very strong alliance with these tribes. So he was a practical businessman in one sense, but on the other hand, he also understood that in order to really do well in his business, he had to acculturate and become more like his customers.
Bent's Fort saw a lot of different people coming west. This was, if anybody was ever in the West at that time here in the 1830s and 40s, they came through Bent's Fort.
If you were a celebrity in the West in the 1830s and 1840s, sooner or later you would travel to Bent's Fort. In addition to the Bents and St. Vrain, Kit Carson was an employee. This was before he was the famous folkloric scout and guide. He was working as a former trapper and working as a hunter at the post. Francis Parkman, one of the great American historians of the early 19th century, traveled to the post. John C. Fremont visited the post, the great pathfinder of the West, an American explorer who sensationalized his explorations and really drove this hunger for Americans to move into the West, to explore and to settle. He wrote reports of his explorations and lionized Kit Carson and made exploring the West seem like an adventure to many Americans.
Well, when you talk about the stories of this place as told by visitors that came through, certainly one of them that's at the top of everybody's list is Susan McGoffin and Susan's visit. The fact that she was keeping a diary, writing her impressions, and it was really the only woman's view we have of what Bent's Fort was like.
There is no place on earth, I believe, where man lives and gambling in some form or other is not carried on. Here in the fort, and who could have supposed such a thing, they have a regularly established billiard room, and they have a regular racetrack. And I hear the cackling of chickens at such a rate that sometimes I shall not be surprised to hear of a cockpit.
The fort provided services to wayfarers and settlers. If your wagon was broken, they would repair it for you. If you needed oxen or horses to replace your worn-out livestock, they could supply it for you. If you needed goods to make up for provisions you lost on the trail, they would have it at Bent's Fort as well. If you needed information about the best mountain passes to take, or where the good hunting grounds were, where the bison were traveling, or what the political situation was in New Mexico, Bent's Fort was a pretty good place to pick up that kind of intelligence as well. It was really the place to be in the American West. And of course, not every remarkable person who lived at the fort was famous. It was a sad fact that as Missourians, Charles and William Bent owned slaves. One resident couple at the fort was Charlotte and Dick Green. They were slaves owned by Charles Bent. Dick Green was the blacksmith at the fort. He repaired wagons, he worked with metalwork. Charlotte ran the kitchen. And although we know very little about her, what we do know about her is that life in a Western trading post for a slave was somewhat different than being a slave in the plantations of the East. She had a relative amount of control over her world. The kitchen was her zone, and she was very proud of what she did there. She created meals for the important people who would come to the fort. She was famous throughout the region for her baking and her cooking. She called herself the only lady in this damn Indian country.
It's kind of surprising to folks that that fort was never attacked. Bent's Fort was never attacked. And the main reason for that is because William Bent was trying to keep up good relations with the tribes. That's who he was trading with and doing business with. If you were fighting with them, they weren't going to trade you their buffalo hides. So he kept up as good relations as possible with the tribes. In fact, he didn't want the tribes fighting with each other either. That would take away from their time of hunting buffalo and getting hides for them. So he, in fact, brokered a treaty between the Cheyenne and the Arapahoe, kind of their allies up here, and the Comanches to the south of the river, and had brokered a treaty here. So he was very instrumental in keeping the peace on the plains.
Bents were able to develop better than average relations with the Indians. This was a place to come if you needed manufactured goods, especially goods that you couldn't make on your own, whether you were an Indian group, a Mexican group, an Anglo group. This was your only outlet, if you will.
Bent's Fort was really a hub of globalism, a cosmopolitan village. You could at any given time hear people speaking in English, or Cheyenne or Arapahoe, or Apache or Navajo, or Ute, or German, or Russian, or Spanish, to be sure. All of these languages sort of wove together in this rich tapestry, held together by the universal sign language of the plains. When you couldn't speak with someone, you could still get along through a very formalized set of hand gestures, where they were trading goods literally from all over the world, where people from different cultures and ideas were coming together and creating a new kind of syncretism where they could take the best of each culture and blend it together into something new and exciting. It seemed like Americans could find a way to coexist with American Indians, that perhaps there were ways to build new societies and cultures which were inclusive to not just American Indians, but to Hispanos, to African Americans. It was an exciting moment, but tragically it was also a short moment in our history.
And so Fort was very significant in opening up the West to the United States. But it did have a lot of things that did go wrong, basically bringing in these diseases, not on purpose. These things ended up here as a result of people moving west. As time went on, the tribes were finding that these herds of buffalo were thinning out more all the time. They had to travel further to find them. Basically, it was a business, but it was also causing a mixing of cultures, marrying into the tribe. It was influencing their lives fairly dramatically.
Trade with Bent's Fort revolutionized the economy of American Indians. It gave them access to markets that were global in reach. The Cheyennes and Arapahoes traded buffalo robes for manufactured goods like guns and gunpowder, flints for their rifles, knives and tomahawks, glass beads, cloth, linen, cotton, wool, blankets, iron pots and kettles, barrel hoops that they would cut into arrowheads, pieces of brass wire or hawk bells that they would use for decoration. It was like going to Walmart, in a sense. You could take your currency, your buffalo robes, and get the supplies that you needed in order to go back out and succeed on the plains. But on the other hand, there were some unanticipated consequences. American Indian tribes ultimately had to compete with each other for control of the hunting grounds, and that led to an increased reliance on war and warfare. The role of women as sort of co-deciders about the daily and monthly lives and yearly lives of the tribes diminished. They simply became processors of this finished goods. And the hides themselves were actually used to fuel the industrialization of America. A bison robe is the largest piece of leather that you were able to find in North America. And they were used not only for coats and lap robes, but also were fashioned into belts which would power industrial machinery, power looms or cotton mills, which would in turn produce the finished goods that were being traded back to the Plains Indians in time. As much as it provided a lot of wealth and opportunity for Cheyenne Indians, it also made them more dependent on that American trade and helped undermine their sovereignty in time.
It was really the first hand of American commerce, if you will, to come out into this part of the world. The first place where the Stars and Stripes was flying, and the folks here, the Bents, the St. Vrains, and the other people traveling the Santa Fe Trail and trading, formed a connection between the United States and Mexico via the Santa Fe Trail, connected Missouri and Santa Fe. But the Bents were really the first folks, the first American folks to come out and really stay in this area and set up a commercial operation.
It was ushering in the thought of Western expansion to the Pacific Ocean. Had it not been here, it's possible that the boundary with Mexico here at Bent's Fort would never have changed. But it brought to light there was something of value here in the West. You could actually live and survive here in the Great American Desert.
One of the most important features of Bent's Fort is that it was situated on what was an international border. The Arkansas River demarcated the international boundary between the United States to the north and Mexico to the south. As a result of that, Bent's Fort was in an extremely strategic position for policymakers in the United States who were considering an expansion into Mexico. It was, in many ways, an outpost of manifest destiny. One of the great ironies of the partners is that although Charles and William Bent and Sir Anne St. Vrain were heavily engaged in the society of their customers, they were all Americans too. And their sympathies were with American expansion. So that meant that political leaders like Andrew Jackson or the important Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton paid very close attention to cultivating their relationship with the Bents and St. Vrain, because they knew that at some point the fort might serve as a jumping off point for expansion. And in fact it was. When the war between the United States and Mexico broke out in 1846, policymakers identified Bent's Fort as an ideal jumping off place for an invasion of Mexico. And in 1846, General Stephen Watts Kearny marched a troop of soldiers from Fort Leavenworth, Missouri to Bent's Old Fort and used it as a staging post, as a quartermaster supply depot, as a hospital for soldiers who were intent on invading Mexican territory.
And as a result of that, the Cheyenne and other tribes are less likely to come to the fort for trade. Along with that, cholera was running rampant in St. Louis, and it was inadvertently brought west and spread amongst the tribes. Cholera is a disease that can be spread by use of water holes, the same water holes and such. And the tribes were finding that this disease was running rampant through the tribe, and they were basically told to move away from the fort because of this. And many of them perished because of cholera. Along with that, we see grass being used up, the natural grasses growing along the Arkansas River. You had to move further away to graze your livestock. The water holes were muddied and things were not well.
The buffalo trade flourished through the 1830s and into the 1840s, but by the late 1840s, it too went into decline. And the arrival of soldiers and subsequently settlers and gold seekers on their way to California drove away the bison and spread disease among the Plains Indian tribes in a way that effectively destroyed the trade at Bent's Fort.
We do know that in the latter years of the fort, Bent was spending more time on the trail. We were finding that the fort may have been falling into disrepair. Some of the archaeology reveals beam pockets right in the middle of the room. Kind of tells you that maybe the roads were starting to cave in, it was falling into disrepair. All we know for sure is that the fort is found in ruins, partial ruins, in 1846. No one actually saw who destroyed the fort or how that was done.
There's, again, many theories about it. Perhaps he didn't want a rival trader to come in and use the post. He was a little peeved at the military for kind of taking the place over during the war with Mexico and never really compensating him for that. So maybe he didn't want the army to take it over and use it. Maybe he didn't want the Comanches or another, hostile tribe to take it and use it for cover or something like that. Maybe he did it to try and stop the spread of cholera, because cholera was sweeping across the plains that summer, killed half the southern Cheyenne tribe according to their tribal lore, and one way to stop cholera back then was to burn things. But for whatever reason, he pulled out and left it burning, left it smoldering.
And in time, he moved his trade operations about 60 miles down the river to what was known as the Big Timbers, a big winter encampment for the Cheyennes and Arapahoes. And he built a stone fort there called Bent's New Fort that he operated for a number of years and ultimately sold it to the United States Army. In the early 1970s, the United States Park Service reconstructed the fort on its original site. So when visitors visit Bent's Old Fort today, what they see is entirely a reconstruction.
This place was set aside, in the language of Congress, to commemorate the role such posts played in the opening of the West. Unlike a museum where things are behind glass and you can't touch them, Bent's Fort is a full, immersive, sensory experience. It's a neat place to really get up close and touch history.
I think we like to remember the fur trade era and places like Bent's Old Fort as really the best that we can be as Americans. Enterprising, opportunistic, but accommodating. Taking the best from other cultures and bringing it together in order to create something new. Bent's Fort did that in many ways. It accomplished what it set out to do. Its great tragedy is that it was also one of the wheels set in motion to bring American expansion and really bring about the end of the era that it helped create. William Bent died in 1868 of natural causes. At the end of his life, the fur trade was gone, the buffalo robe trade had been destroyed. He never stopped being a staunch friend to the Cheyennes and Arapahoes. He defended their interests as an Indian agent and as an ally through the course of his adult life. But tragically, he really lived to see the world that he had enjoyed with the Cheyennes and Arapahoes come unraveled in time. The Sand Creek Massacre, the forced relocation of Cheyennes and Arapahoes out of the Great Plains onto reservations, the destruction of the trade which had enriched him, really all occurred during his lifetime.
The idea of cross-cultural cooperation, the idea of a lot of different cultures coming together and working together. It was a commercial venture where the Mexican, American, and Native American cultures all came together peaceably in trade, and I think there are certainly some lessons to be learned there.
Colorado Experience is a co-production of Rocky Mountain PBS and History Colorado.
History Colorado brings history to life for audiences of all ages. Through exhibits, collections, and historic preservation programs throughout the state, History Colorado connects people to the stories, places, and heritage of Colorado's past that provide perspectives on today and inspire our choices for tomorrow. Find out more at www.historycolorado.org. Additional funding provided by El Pomar Foundation and the Betcher Foundation, celebrating 75 years of philanthropy in Colorado.
With additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And from viewers like you, thank you. This episode is available on Blu-ray. Visit our website to order. There's more Colorado Experience online at rmpbs.org/Colorado Experience, Facebook and Twitter.